I grew up in a farm town, and the only place to get groceries besides the grossly overpriced Shopco on the edge of town was the family-owned supermarket, Robertson's. The Robertson family was very attractive in the community, but also had a reputation for misery to straight-up evil, depending on who you asked. If you asked me and the rest of the bag boys, Robertson's had a dark aura around it. Many features contributed, like the vaulted ceilings in the back room, the creaking floors in the offices upstairs, and the door hidden behind a pile of old shelves that seemed to lead under the loading docks. The worst was the patriarch of the Robertsons, Blaine. He was too old to handle the business decisions, but was too stubborn to let his toupee-tooting son to take it off his hands. So he spent his days shuffling around the floors, agonizing the bag boys at every turn. He'd chastise us for clocking in more than a minute early, and he'd chastise us for standing at the clock with a minute left on our shift. He'd chastise us for laziness the second we weren't actively moving items. I always joked that Blaine was a vampire. He just refused to pass. Why else is there never a call over the intercom for kids who lost their parents? One night, my suspicions were reinforced. Blaine had showed up about 9 to take care of some office work upstairs. With all of our closing duties done, my partner for the night and I lollygagged in the storeroom right at the foot of the office stairs. When 10 rolled around and it was time to close, I figured I'd let Blaine know we were locking up, and I started up the stairs and suddenly noticed it was dark. I got to the top and looked around. Not a single light in the offices were on. We had been standing at the bottom of the stairs the whole time, and Blaine had never passed us. Even when Blaine isn't looking like Nosferatu, strange things happen upstairs. The exposed water pipes leading upstairs twang like someone hit them with a hammer. Footsteps on the creaky floors echo through the whole back room. And all of this happens when the offices are pitch black, as we stand next to the stairs. One night, my partner and I got freaked out by the noise from the offices and decided to spend the remainder of the shift lapping the store. But as we walked perpendicular to the aisle, a can of green beans halfway down the vegetable aisle suddenly fell off the shelf. We put it back in place and started walking again. 2 aisles down, another can fell off. This time, as I put it back in place, a can 15 feet down the aisle flew off the shelf. We left that one sitting 100 yards around the cash register for the rest of the shift. To top it off though, a bag boy requested to be taken off night shifts after an experience he had in the break room. The break room has 2 small bathrooms, male and female. He was taking his dinner break when he had heard a baby crying from the women's bathroom. He had been there 5 minutes already and hadn't seen anyone come in, much less a baby. He ensured the crying for 5 more minutes before he got concerned and knocked on the door. Repeated knocks and questions got nothing back except for the non-stop bawling. He was finally convinced something had happened to the mother and cracked the door open, only to find the room dark and empty. This happened about 3 years ago. My best friend and I grew up in a sleepy wannabe New Jersey Central Florida town, and we were the outcasts. We had met in 6th grade when I'd overheard her talking to another classmate about bionicles, my 11-year-old self's passion. We became fast friends and soon were inseparable. Soon began the gauntlet of sleepovers, birthday parties, and family gatherings. We were practically siblings. She was the first person I came out as bisexual to, and in turn, I was the first person she told about being trans. Her home life was tumultuous, though I can't say mine was any better. We often had the habit of taking refuge in each other's houses. Like I said, we became like siblings. Her father was an alcoholic, strict, and prone to physical discipline. Her sister was a stuck-up girl who soon gravitated towards the hicks and jocks when she entered high school, and her mother was a pseudo-vegan hippie love child held over from the 80s. When I was 23, herself 22 at the time, we had another long night of sleepovers in order to let her escape yet another fight with her mother. She'd recently lost her job at Walmart, and I was going into my first shift at a Taco Bell the next day. On the drive home the next morning, she excitedly told me that since she now had her own vehicle, she would be applying at pizza places that were in need of a driver. I was proud. It was the first time she'd ever hunted for a job on her own, and I'd usually be the one to coax her to apply where I was working. Not that she ever lasted very long. My first training day goes by quite well. My co-workers are friendly and try to get me to talk more. My manager likes to playfully embarrass me, a fat white guy, by trying to get me to talk hood to the other workers. Being a training day, it wasn't a very long shift, but I'd gotten up early in anticipation, and this was my first day on the job in a few months. I got home around noon, informed some of my internet friends that my first day went well, and around 5 p.m. I started to bed down, drained from a good day. As I'm preparing to lay in my bed, I get a stream message, her lamenting another fight with her mother and asking if she can come over. I'd started to grow a bit wary of the fights on their end. I had begun to repair my relationship with my family and a few friends, and I had given her advice many times on how to better approach things. In my infinite wisdom and eagerness to sleep, I left the message unread and drifted off into slumber. Around 8 p.m., I am awakened by her bursting into my room in a panic. Having just been ripped from a dream, I'm groggy and disoriented, and I drag myself to the bathroom to relieve my bladder and come back into the room to find her rocking back and forth on my bed. That's when I notice she's covered in blood. She informs me that she just saw someone murder her mother with a knife. My mind goes blank. In the deepest parts of my mind, alarm bells start ringing. Isn't the rocking back and forth a bit overdramatic? Why didn't she call the police? But this is my best friend. I've known her for over a decade, and we were the only two people in the world we would count on. I suppress it and go to inform my sister and stepfather. My mother had passed away the year prior, and it was roughly a month to the anniversary of her death. We were all in a dark place, antisocial as always, and it was the only way we knew how to handle emotional issues. When I inform my family, they immediately go to the same place I had, though they are far more vocal about it. I offer excuses that I knew myself were flimsy. And so then I return to the room with phone in hand. I convinced her to call the cops, and I can hear her explain the details over the phone. A man in a black ski mask. And when the cops arrive, she swears up and down that it's most likely her father. They send cars over to check the crime scene and take her in for a statement. I ride with her in the back of the cop car over to the sheriff's office. It gets to be around 2 a.m. Her sister was brought in, as was her father. I have work the next morning and request to be taken home by a police officer. It takes me a while to go to sleep that morning, and the next day at work I'm quiet until my manager asks me what happened. I inform him, but decided to work the rest of my training shift. When I get home, my sister informed me she confessed. Her mother threatened to kick her out for not being able to find a job, and in a rage, she had taken the kitchen knife and done what you know to her mother. My mind froze like a bad computer, and I turned to face my monitor. I was in a Discord call at the time, and all I could weakly say is, my best friend confessed to murdering her mother, before hanging up and laying on my bed. Her last trial was the 7th of this month. I don't know the result, though my grandmother tells me she took a plea deal for life in prison rather than the death penalty. Part of me wants to contest that, to demand that they take the death penalty for ridding the earth of such a peaceful and caring woman. A large part of me is glad she's being punished. Natalie, you are my best friend, my sister, and my platonic soulmate. But please, let's never meet again. I've always had incidents with paranormal activity, but this one story still baffles me and everyone involved to this day. Just thinking about it now gives me goosebumps. For a bit of background info, this occurred in Lake City, Florida. My husband and I found the perfect house for our family of 5 in 2007. It was a huge 2,000 plus square foot mobile home on 5 acres, 4 bedrooms with 2 baths. It was amazingly within our budget, only $830 a month and rent to own. So we signed the contract assuming the low price was due to it being in the middle of nowhere. Our 3 kids were 9 months, 3 years, and 5 years old at the time. The older 2 were ecstatic to finally have a room of their own, but this was short-lived after moving in. From the very beginning, we were all a bit anxious in the house, but we kept saying it was due to the large size of the home. We moved from a very small 2-bedroom apartment, and it being located so far out in the middle of nowhere in the country, plus it being a new house, period. It started by us noticing lights on that we knew were supposed to be off, doors being open that were supposed to be closed and vice versa, bumps in the middle of the night with no explanation. The kids all started having night terrors, and after about a week, we discovered the older 2 kids asleep on the 9-month-old's floor beside her crib. They started doing this every night. My 5-year-old daughter had such bad dreams one night it caused her to vomit. She came in crying and throwing up, saying there was a man on fire floating outside her window. She was truly terrified. Back then I worked night shift, and my husband was the one dealing with the freaky incidents at home at night. After several months of various incidents, my husband had to go out of town for 2 weeks due to his job. They were going to build a house in Steinhatchee, Florida. Since I was working night shift, the kids were shipped off to the grandparents. This event happens on the first night of my 2 days off, and my mum said she'd keep the kids for an extra night so I could catch up on some much-needed sleep. Now, backing up. The town my husband was working in did not have cell reception for our carrier, and the only place he could get service to call was in the town standing in a very specific location, so he couldn't call from the job site or the house they were staying in, and I rarely got to speak to him while he was gone. He literally had to drive into town, stand next to one of those large ice cream maker machines, which he discovered by accident one morning while getting their cooler ice for the day, that his phone randomly downloaded all his missed texts, so he figured he got service while standing there specifically. On my first night alone in this house, I was truly scared after several hours of hearing things. Here I am beyond exhausted from barely getting any sleep the week before, and I can't sleep because of the house noises. I went out to the couch and decided to try and fall asleep with the TV way up loud to drown out the noises. I carried a weapon under my pillow and another one next to me and felt safe enough to fall asleep. At 3 a.m., a call wakes me up. I looked at the screen and it said, "My baby," aka husband. I answered. He was in a panic. "Honey, are you okay?" "Yeah, I'm fine. Why?" He's freaking out, telling me he had a nightmare. He asked if I was asleep on the couch. He asked if I had a weapon under my pillow and another one next to me, saying specifically what they were. He asked what I was wearing, and I said yes to all his questions. He even confirmed the direction my head was. This were all things that he should not have known, considering we hadn't spoken a number of days. He's all but hysterical at one point, saying he had a nightmare where a man broke in and did horrific things to me before ending my life. Any other time I would have called him crazy and told him I was staying put, but there was something about his voice and the desperation that got me out of the house. At this point, I decided to leave, especially considering how out of character it was for him. And I heard a bang coming from the opposite end of the house. My blood runs cold. It was almost like a bad omen. Since he's not the type to normally act like this, I panic and make him stay on the phone with me while I grabbed the car keys and my purse. I hit the button on the car to turn on the lights and make a run to the car. I got the hell out of there, not bothering to change clothes or grab anything. Once he verified that I was on the road safe, he said he'd call me tomorrow and check on things. I then called my mum to let her know I'm coming, and I tell her the story of how this all came to be. I drove the 45 minutes to her house, shaking the entire way. After arriving, and some time talking to her, I settle in and fall asleep. I tried calling my husband in the morning, but kept getting voicemail. That's completely normal for the town he's working in. At this point, I must go to the house to grab clothes and a few bits. I made my mum go with me because I was still freaked out by everything, and there was no way I was going back there alone. When we get there, I immediately noticed the screen had been cut and the window was broken out. Picture a normal double-wide mobile home with a large deck and a window on either side of the door. The window that was broke out was the one right next to the door. I called the police immediately. They cleared the house and walked through with me to see if anything was missing and to add to the report. There wasn't. I wouldn't have known if someone had been in there if it hadn't been for the screen and window being broken. I tried to call my husband, but couldn't get through to him. And after leaving several voicemails, he finally called. I told him that his weird nightmare just might have saved my life, and explained everything to him. He's completely at a loss and asked me what the hell I was talking about, that he hadn't called me. I froze. Yes you did. He's adamant he didn't. He says he didn't have a nightmare, nor did he call, and we argue for several minutes because I knew he called. How could he? When he said when he was at home all night, and he only got cell service in one place. That hadn't even crossed my mind at that point. I told him to check his call logs. He didn't have any outgoing calls. My phone, however, showed that I had received a call from my baby at 3 a.m. I sent him a screenshot of my phone, and he has no recollection of ever calling or of the nightmare. I'll never forget the panic in his voice, the desperation for me to leave, the details he couldn't have known. Who called me and saved my life that night? The police didn't find any fingerprints or anything that could lead to an arrest. We ended up moving out very soon after, because we didn't feel safe, especially when we were dealing with a haunting at the same time. I spoke to 2 of our neighbors, and they said no one ever leased it for more than 6 months. Where I'm stuck is who called. I used to work graveyard shift in a nursing home in Texas, and there were 3 occasions that I saw what I considered to be shadow figures. Nothing scary happened, but it's the only occasion I've been at where I've had personal paranormal experiences. Maybe a week or 2 before this occurred, a man passed away suddenly after waking up and following his normal routine. He went from getting himself dressed and going for his daily walk, and after having 1 coffee, in the time it took him to ask for another cup, he suddenly stopped breathing and was gone. During normal work duties, I saw a completely black head peek around a corner, and then go back to being obscured by the walls, like a man peeked around the corner, then went back on the hall. There were no noises associated with anyone leaving a room or anyone walking down the hall, and when I went to investigate, the hall where the man peeled around the corner there was no one there. The man that suddenly passed away lived in a room down the hallway, and the head peeking around the corner, I think it's him. Maybe he just hasn't been able to move on yet. The second incident was when I was working graveyard shift. We did some housekeeping duties since a lot of people sleep through the night, and I guess they wanted to give us something to do. So I was dusting around the TV and saw a human shadow walk behind a couch reflected in the TV. Again, no sounds of a resident opening a door. So at this point, everyone was in their rooms sleeping. I assumed it was my co-worker, since I hadn't seen her in a little while, so I figured she was doing some cleaning in another area. A few minutes later, while I was still dusting, she came out of the area where we do laundry, so clearly that wasn't her. Again, there was no resident up because the walk that I saw was completely fluid and did not resemble a resident, as they all were not physically able to walk like the figure I saw reflected. It was someone in their 20s, with no physical difficulties. That's how they walked, and there was no color reflected in the TV. It was fully black, like a walking shadow. That unsettled me for a while. The third incident is there was a woman who knew was passing away. Our duty with her was to keep her clean and comfortable while she was in the process of passing. That night I saw through the window of the nurse's station a pure white shadow walk one way down the hall the woman was living on, who was in the process of passing away. Then I saw the figure walk the other way down the hall. I then saw the figure walk the first way down the hall again. To this day I didn't know why the figure was white when the first two figures I saw were black, but I'd like to think it was the woman's guardian angel of some kind, staying with her or waiting for her to pass to take her to the afterlife. After moving to Mississippi and getting jobs here, I've had no more paranormal experiences, so there must have been a high level of energy at that place in Texas. It was a fairly new facility, so maybe that had something to do with stirring up energies. There was this one time that I was out on a date with a girl. We did a happy hour dining thing that went well, so we wanted to keep things going. There were a decent number of red flags flying, chief among them being that her ex was a 1%er in a local biking gang and was in prison. But she was hot and I'm an idiot, so we wandered down the street to her favorite bar. At that point, she's a full-on social butterfly, wandering the bar chatting to all the regulars, so instead of following her around like a puppy dog, I just saddle up to the bar and start talking to the group of guys next to me. Very nice dudes, very chatty and amiable. Eventually, a number of bikers pull up. Now I'm a bit concerned and ask my new friends if everything's cool, since I told them my situation. They reassure me everything's fine and I'm welcome there. Maybe an hour later, I wander off to the bathroom, come back, and the dudes tell me in a concerned tone that I need to leave now. To this day I have no idea what happened, but there was no mistaking the urgency of their tone. So I promptly paid my tab and headed to my car. I hadn't seen my date in a while, so I was a bit surprised when she came running out the bar, jumped into the passenger seat and just yelled, "Drive." No high-speed chase or anything after that, but let's just say I was a bit freaked out. She was mostly incoherent at that point. I took her back to her place, and we got there and she tried getting freaky with me in the car. After the night's events and with her being wasted, I gave the whole situation a hard pass. She started crying. Then in short, order puking out of my door. It kinda goes without saying there was no second date. My sense of self-preservation kind of outweighed my curiosity at that point. This dream has stayed with me, and I think it always will. Although not profound or life-altering, I've never been able to shake the memory and the feeling of absolute terror and dread. To give some context, this was a number of years ago. Currently, I'm 23 years old, and this dream occurred at the age of 11. As a child, I suffered from sleep paralysis for a number of years. At first, This terrified me to the point of me not wanting to sleep. It became so bad that I pushed myself to states of exhaustion before my body could no longer remain conscious and I would pass out, only to return to the horrifying imagery of my subconscious. The first time I ever experienced sleep paralysis, I still lived with my aunt who fostered me, which is another story entirely. But I was in my old room in my old bunk bed, and I remember it all so clearly. I awake to the sensation of not being able to move, struggle as I may, and this confused me, but didn't scare me, not yet. It was only when I saw what stood in the corner of the room did my fear really start to descend. It was a hooded figure, all black, so very black, darker than the darkest shade of black. In its hand was some kind of weapon, like an oddly shaped axe or scythe. Its face was that of a skeleton, ghostly white, and dark black holes that felt as though they were sucking the life straight out of you, where his eyes should have been. It stood there, staring at me. My eyes widened as I prayed for this to be some kind of dream or hallucination. I was frozen in fear, not that I could escape, even if I had the courage to move. Its sharp, crooked, daggered teeth began to form a smile. The most gut-wrenching, heart-stopping smile I could ever imagine. The kind of smile that alludes to such confidence, such domination and power over me, that it only frightened me more and intensified my fear. It slowly, creakily, almost clockwork doll-like began to turn its head, continuing until it was such at an unnatural angle, and then it started to inch towards me. It didn't walk, it simply began to move closer. It didn't obey any natural law or any flicker of logic. I guess in retrospect it makes perfect sense, just adding to my confusion. It edged even closer to me, unmoving and unchanging in its deadlock, icy grin, its gaze of absolute horror still peering into my soul. Looking back, I can still picture it, and it disgusts me. It continued until it was halfway across the room. Then, without warning, it just stopped. This is where my blood ran cold. It slowly raised its arms from beneath its cloak to reveal its hideous, revolting arm, a mixture of rotting flesh on bone, decomposing right there in front of me, and the sight of it made me want to gag. Then it did something I'll never forget. It methodically raised its hand slowly, that putrid thing, and began to point. Not at something in the room, but at me. My eyes widened further still, and my heart began to thump in my chest. It then placed both hands upon his head, and began to twist and pull his head back into place. The noise sent shivers down my spine. It creaked and cracked, and screamed back into place, and then the figure began to approach me. It was at this point full-blown panic set in, and I started to struggle. I kicked and twisted and tried to throw my body, but I could not. I couldn't move. I was trapped and paralyzed as the ominous creature drew ever closer. I couldn't free my invisible shackles. So I screamed with all my might. I thought at the very least my family would be alerted. At the very least, they'd surely see what happened to me, for whatever small comfort that may bring. But to my dismay, no sound came from my mouth. I tried again, but now the figure was almost at the foot of my bed. My cries for help failed. In my head, I was screaming like a madman. The figure was now at the foot of my bed, only now it's not smiling, but it looks more terrifying, teeth all aligned jaggedly. I continued to struggle, but it was futile. It continued to get closer and closer until it was stood right in front of me at the side of my bed. I was frozen. I just looked back at it, petrified. It leaned in until its face was face to face with me, and at this point I knew my life was over. It reached its arm towards me, and it screamed a blood-curdling scream. I closed my eyes and prepared myself to be ripped apart by this thing. But no, nothing. Just like that, it was gone. I look around my room with my heart thumping so hard I thought it would burst from my ribcage. I was sweating profusely, and I was afraid. I scanned the room, but it was empty. I turned on the light. Nothing. I crawled back into bed, confused and fearful. No more sleep was had the next night, and the light remained on. The previous night's ordeal haunted me the next day, and I couldn't focus. I tried to talk with my aunt, but she put it down to a bad dream, maybe a demon that had taken a liking. The latter was her way of trying to be funny and reassure me that it wasn't real, but I didn't find it comforting in the slightest. In fact, it made me more paranoid, and I dreaded going back to bed that night. When night came, I wasn't prepared, and I decided I wouldn't sleep in fear of what I saw returning. I tried my hardest, but eventually my struggles resulted in failure. It was no good. My eyes became heavy and tears started to stream down my face. Whatever that thing was had shaken me to my very core. It might sound silly to some, but I genuinely believed that when I fell back asleep, my life would be in serious danger. I sobbed and cried myself to sleep, and the next morning I awoke and I was fine. No figure, no traumatic experience at all. And this filled me with so much joy than ever before. Maybe it had just been a dream. Maybe I didn't have to face this thing. It was exhilarating. Later on, I would learn about sleep paralysis, as I did end up suffering from it for quite a few years, and ended up doing some research which confirmed it to be nothing more than sleep-related hallucinations. Even when they would return several times as I returned to sleep, eventually I did discover something useful, something to help you escape, even if it's just temporarily. The trick is to move. I know you probably think, well, that's useful considering you're legitimately paralyzed, hence the name sleep paralysis. But there's something many people fail to consider. Yes, it's true you can't move your arms or legs or even your head. You can't scream or make a sound. But what you can do is move your tongue. It sounds silly, but move your tongue as much as possible and as quickly as possible. And if you try and waggle those fingertips and toes at the same time, you'll wake up much faster. Maybe there's someone hearing this who's suffering from sleep paralysis. Maybe there's people listening who already know this and don't believe it would work. But if you're suffering, and the once tranquil thought of sleep has been replaced with the fear of what awaits you, then give it a try. It may just help. I'm a 20-year-old college student who works part-time on weekends as a night shift security officer on campus. My partner is a 22-year-old student in the same situation, same company and job. This experience is theirs. We are both currently on duty at different posts, and they messaged me about this experience a few minutes ago. I'm sharing it on their behalf. My partner is called Jay. They're currently working at the front desk of the Fine Arts building of our college. The building is on Broad Street, the main street of our city. Around the time of night, 3:30, there would be the occasional student coming out of that building, and a pedestrian on the street every now and then. Jay's security cameras show the area just outside the building, including footage of the dumpster and back parking lot and the sidewalk out front, which is well lit by the street lamps since it's a main street. The cameras have about a 5-second delay, but show smooth enough footage. Jay messages me. I just watched a person dissolve on my camera system like the wind blew them away. It wasn't any kind of screen glitching I've ever seen. Upon questioning them, they told me they saw what looked like two figures wearing hoodies with their hoods up, who were not identical, that seemed to be walking together. They said only one of the two figures dissolved, and that the one who was solid didn't seem to realize the other person was there. They didn't seem to be talking, and when the figure dissolved, the solid figure didn't even seem to notice. The solid person's walk/cycle movements didn't glitch out when the other person dissolved. The camera seemed to be working correctly. The figure didn't appear to glitch or pop out of existence. Jay specifically described him as dissolving into the wind. What could have Jay seen? Has anyone ever had a similar experience? Does anyone have reading material or a term to search up? I know it's nothing crazy, but we're scared and unnerved, and truly unsure of what to do. When I was 15, a friend and I went for a lot of walks around town, a small town with about 5,000 to 6,000 people living there. We were going to this cyber cafe in town to meet a few friends, and we often took different streets to get to places, just to keep it interesting. We were about to go onto the main street, off one of the side streets, and a man on a bicycle approached us. He got off his bike and asked us a few small talk questions. Something didn't seem right about him. He was probably mid-40s, and we both kept inching away but didn't want to come off as too rude. So we answered about the weather or traffic. Then he paused and said we had to go. And I said, and I'll never forget, "You look so young. I don't want to get in trouble, but I need to touch something. I just need to touch you. You should come with me." And he started rambling. I just felt terror. I couldn't even speak. I grabbed my friend's hand and turned. We sprinted the rest of the way to the cafe, and as soon as we were inside, we asked to use the phone. I called my mum to pick us up, while my friend told the worker what happened, and that guy looked like. A month later, I received my first cell phone. This is something that happened to me in 2014, about 2 weeks after my dad passed away. I am a 39-year-old female, originally from Miami, Florida, and I've been living in the Hudson Valley area of New York for about 6 years, when in February of 2014, my 59-year-old seemingly fit and seemingly healthy father was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer that had spread to his liver. I was devastated. As being a registered nurse, I knew there was no hope. My dad decided to take the chemotherapy treatment against his better judgment because my mum, brother, and myself were so distraught that we begged him to try as we prayed for a miracle. After 7 months of feeling sick and making little to no progress as had been expected, my dad, mum, and the doctor came to the decision my dad would be placed on a hospice, and it was time for me to fly back home and spend my dad's last days with him at the house and surrounded by our large and supportive extended family. I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to tell my father how much I loved him and what a perfect father he had always been to me. 2 days of being on hospice care, all around the clock morphine, my dad fell into an almost coma-like state, where he would not open his eyes and barely moved. The next 5 days were full of anxiety, sadness, and at times desperation. We didn't want to lose him, but we didn't want for him to suffer anymore. Finally, after 7 days of being home on hospice, on a beautiful and sunny Miami day, my dad passed away surrounded by family. I was always extremely close to my dad, and at that moment, it was surreal for me. I let out the pain and emotions I had been keeping in for the past week, in the form of loud, anguished sobs as I hugged his dead body and kissed his face and head. My dad was gone. About a week later, after ensuring my mum and younger brother were okay, as could be expected, I flew back to New York, as I had work and my children and husband needed me. I was in a fog of sadness and disbelief as I tried to get back to my routine. 2 weeks after my dad's passing, I found myself in a dream where my mum and brother and I were walking in an indoor place with lots of people from different parts of the world walking around and talking to each other. There was a river that ran through the place, and I and my mum and brother followed it until it reached a bend, and upon trying right to continue following it, my dad appears in front of us. He looked young, healthy, and radiantly glowing. His beautiful green eyes were healthy again, so bright, and I yelled in absolute joy, "Dad, I miss you so much." We hugged and then began to speak telepathically, not using words. It's a bit difficult to explain, but basically our communication was entirely through feelings and in our mind, but no words were exchanged. I simply understood what he was conveying to me, and he understood me the same way. This is what he expressed to me. "I don't look like this anymore. I came to you in this way so that you'd recognize me. I knew the family was all there, but I missed my brother. Tell Jay that not all of them are good and to not give his light to just anyone." It's important to understand here that my dad's brother was not present during my father's last 2 days because he was in prison and wasn't due to be released for at least another year. The two had grown up very close because they had been abandoned on the family farm in Cuba to be raised by relatives as my grandmother moved to Havana to start a new life. Regarding Jay, he's my little brother and my dad's youngest son. He had been doing drugs and spending time with bad people, and although we didn't know the extent of his involvement in this type of lifestyle, we knew he was potentially in danger. Although smart and spunky, Jay has always been kind-hearted and sees the best in others, so he's an easy target for malicious people to take advantage of. After communicating with my dad for a bit, his late mother, my grandmother who passed away a year earlier, came into the dream with desperation and urgency. I didn't want to speak with her, but she insisted I had to listen because she had things to say to the family. I looked at my dad sadly, and he communicated that he could not stay and could not communicate with me anymore because she was there. Apparently she was stronger than him. He was gone. Despite her insistence and desperation, I didn't listen to my grandmother except to learn that she was trapped in a place and needed to move on. I did not try to help or listen further as my dad was gone. I woke up. I had an intense feeling that this was not a dream. And now 5 years later, I remember the dream vividly, and the feeling that this was a real communication with my dad and, unfortunately, my grandmother. I believe my dad wanted to let me know he was okay, but I also got the feeling that he was very new in the place where he was and not yet strong enough to truly hold his own there. I believe he had an opportunity to speak with me and took it. I've had dreams of him in the last few years, but never one like that. I love and miss my dad every day. This happened after work this past Christmas Eve. I work a later second shift from 5 p.m. to 1 a.m. or until we're done. I should also mention that while the warehouse is in a nicer area, a couple of blocks down it gets sketchy at night. We've gone down around 2 a.m. and me and my one friend were the first out to the parking lot and were standing there talking while we're warming up our cars. We were talking for maybe 5 to 10 minutes, and during this time I saw this small sedan drive by, slowly, but didn't think much of it because it was a little icy out, and I figured we were just being cautious. But then I saw it slowly coming back down the road from where it came west and pulled in and parked in the parking lot across from us, which was strange because it's a welding shop parking lot, and no one's ever there past 10 p.m. besides police doing speed traps. At that point, I pointed it out to my friend and he said he noticed it as well and thought it was weird. Then this big dude got out the car and walked across the street over to me and my friend while the car he got out of drove off. He asked my friend for a smoke, and as he did that, I walked over to my car to start scraping it off so he would hopefully just not talk to me. But as soon as I stepped back out of my car with my wallet in hand, so I could use one of my cards to scrape the windows. He called over to me. I didn't want to be rude, even though something felt off about the situation. But I said, screw it, there's cameras watching me, and the rest of the workers should be out in 10, so I'll be fine. I'm 6 foot, 180 pounds, soaking wet, and the dude was a good bit bigger than me. I'm guessing 6 foot 2, 6 foot 4, and a solid 250 pounds. He was trying to make small talk with me and ask about what we do there, how it sucks we have to work on Christmas Eve and just random stuff like that, but I got the feeling he was sizing me up. So even though I have extreme social anxiety and can barely make eye contact with people I know, I remember my grandpa always telling me if I'm in a sketchy situation with someone to stand tall, chest out, and make direct eye contact the entire time. Essentially do whatever makes you look like you aren't scared or nervous, so you look like you're more trouble than you're worth. I saw him keep looking down towards my wallet, so I took a small step back so I could make sure I was within the view of the cameras. Then he said, "So, hey man, do you think you could give me a ride to my house? It's just down the street. I ran out of gas at the store, and I need to go back to my house to get money." Now, the grocery store he said his car ran out of gas at is about a mile away down the road to the east. Yet the dude came from the west, and also if he needs a ride to his house in the west, why wouldn't he have just gone there from the person who dropped him off who came from that direction in the first place? I then remembered reading online somewhere that around the holidays people will do whatever they think they can to try to get someone to give them a ride and then force them to take you back to their house and rob them. At this point I'm like, screw this, he's trying to rob me. So I walk back towards my car since I know I have a giant utility knife under the seat and tell him I'm good and to please get off company property. And he was like, "Come on man, it's Christmas Eve," while looking visibly pissed. And I said, "That sucks dude, get off the property." At this point I'm in my car and he can see me reaching under the seat, and he turns and walks away and disappears in the alley a block away. I then go over to my friend's car and tell him what happened, and he said the dude was trying to get him to give him money for smokes, and then tries to convince him to give him a ride to the ATM. 2 days later, a picture of the same guy is on the local police department Facebook page asking for information on him because he was wanted in relation to a string of armed robberies that happened during Christmas time. This happened when I was an 11-year-old boy, visiting a movie theater with my family. I remember I was 11 because I had to lie about my age in order to get into the movie, which was a PG-13. It was a long movie, and by the time it had finished, we had all become rather hungry, and so decided instead of going straight home, would grab something to eat. We jumped into our family Land Rover and headed just a couple of minutes down the road to where several fast food places were located. As was often the case, an argument ensued about which fast food restaurant we would purchase our food from. My family preferred KFC, and me only liking Burger King. In the end, to settle the argument, my father gave me some money and told me to go and get a Burger King, while the rest of my family got their KFC. Delicious. The two shops were so close together after all. Entering the shop, which was completely empty for the most part, I approached the counter and ordered my usual order of burger and fries and took my favorite seat near the window. It was at that point I noticed a man in his mid-40s to late 30s who was looking my way. As soon as our eyes made contact, he said, "Hi," and made his way over to me, placing himself in the seat across the table from where I was. Hello?" I replied, not wanting to be impolite, but wondering what this was about. People where I live are normally very private, and a shy 11-year-old who wasn't used to strangers approaching him, this was a bit out the ordinary. I was just beginning to wonder why a man of his age would be interested in speaking to someone like me, when he said, "Don't worry, kid. I ain't no weirdo." "No, I wouldn't think that," I replied, as I felt my face reddening, and then I felt very shy and awkward. The conversation flowed out of him for the next few minutes, asking me questions such as, is that your favorite food? Do you like cars? What are your thoughts on wrestling? Typical kind of things you might say to coax a child into feeling comfortable with you. And it sort of worked. My answers gradually becoming less short and forced as my confidence grew. He then abruptly stood up to excuse himself, only to return moments later with a milkshake from the place next door. "This is for you," he said, as he placed it on the table. Surprised, I thanked him. I looked up and said, "You went next door? Did you see my dad?" A frightened look came over the man's face. "What?" This confused me. "My family are eating right next door. Didn't you see them?" I described my siblings and parents to him, so he knew he would have seen them. Upon receiving this information, the man's eyes became glued to the door of the restaurant. He slowly rose once more. "I need to use the bathroom," he muttered, and almost backed into it. "Okay," I replied, completely unnerved by this sudden change in body language. This next part all happened very quickly. It started with my becoming faintly aware of the police sirens in the distance, except they were no longer so far in the distance. In fact, the sound of them and the tires skidding to a halt were right outside the door. Then there were men shouting. They were right in the parking lot. I noticed the woman behind the counter trying to get my attention with some hand gestures, and it appeared she was motioning me to remain still. At this point, I was terrified. I didn't want to be involved in whatever was about to happen. Seconds later, the door flew open and police armed with handguns filed into the room. Living in England, I had never seen a gun before, and I was beside myself and began shaking and crying. Upon noticing me, the officers nearest holstered their weapons and crouched down next to me, asking me to first remain calm, immediately followed by, "Did he give you anything to drink? Did you drink anything?" My eyes told him what my mouth was too scared to say, and looked towards the drink positioned next to my food. The senior officer beckoned for another officer who picked up the drink, wrapped it in a plastic bag, and carried it away upright, being careful not to spill it. The same question again and again. "Did you drink any?" Each time I replied no, as I had been so weirded out by the man's sudden change in behavior at hearing about me not being here all alone. I had still felt too strange to eat or drink anything before the police arrived. After a search of the premises yielding only an open bathroom window through which the man had made his escape, eventually my parents were allowed in, but only to ask me the same question. Eventually, the police and my parents believed there was no need for a stomach pump, although after learning of the man's history, they had more than enough reason to be worried. It turns out, this man would often befriend young boys in fast food places and skate parks up and down the country, and then offer them a drink laced with crushed sleeping tablets, take them into his car, drive them out into the woods, and, do bad things. So heavy was the dose of sleeping tablets, and so far away was medical help, that often the boys never woke up and died in their comatose states. I tried not to spend too much time thinking about how it could have happened to me, and I hoped they caught the guy shortly afterwards. It had been the woman working behind the counter who phoned the police after becoming concerned, and the police have been looking for this man for quite some time and rushed to the scene upon getting a matched description. I never got the chance to thank her. To think, it could have been the last time I ever saw my family, and to this day, we now always use the drive-thru instead. This is the most terrifying and vivid dream I've ever experienced, and was a few years ago. I was in my sister's hometown because she was in the hospital, so her room as well as her roommate's room was empty. My parents stayed in her room while I stayed in the roommate's. We'd been there for a few days and I had no previous issues up until then. I was laying on her bed watching TV, on the phone with my boyfriend, and overall drifting off since it was late. I could faintly hear him snoring on the other end of the phone, and I too, myself, felt like I was drifting. I vividly remember what apparently was a dream that felt very real. I was in an unknown house getting out of the bathtub. I walked past the hallway and to the room to sit and watch TV. Everything was normal for a few minutes, when out of the corner of my eye I saw movement. I turned, seeing the long hallway of this unfamiliar house. The light above it was flickering, like it would in a typical scary movie. I ignored it and looked back to the show I was watching, but again saw something with my peripherals. I turned quicker this time, thinking I'd be able to catch whatever it was before it disappeared again, and I saw a tall dark figure, but it wasn't a person. I was immediately filled with fear and dread. I was frozen for what seemed like hours. The light began flickering in longer bursts. It would shut off completely, then light back on for a brief second. And every time it did this, the thing would move closer to me. The light would illuminate it closer than the previous time, and I jumped off the couch and tried opening the door to escape, but no matter how hard I tried, the door just wouldn't open. I was scratching and clawing to no avail. I could sense this thing behind me. I knew it was there, but I was too afraid to turn and see it face to face. I was completely filled with fear. I felt something hot on the back of my neck and heard a mumbling, though I couldn't make out what was being said. I collapsed to my knees, still clawing at the door, this thing looming over me even if I didn't see it. I knew it and felt it. Suddenly my eyes opened and I was back in my sister's townhouse, but unable to move. I was awake again, but in what I can only describe as sleep paralysis. Movement drew my eyes to the right side of the bed, and I could see curtains moving. My mind tried rationalizing it. The fan? No, it was off. Was it the window? No, I never opened it. Again I sensed movement from the curtains. Something was pushing through it, getting closer to me. I could see the outline of a very tall person like the figure in my dream. My brain was screaming for me to get up and run, but my body wasn't cooperating. The curtain pulled off this thing, and I was face to face with it. I wanted to shut my eyes, look away, anything to not see it, but I couldn't even shut my eyes. It was in the shape of a man. As I said previously, it was very tall and skinny, and it was inky black. The blackest black you can imagine. It had no features, no clothes, nothing. It had no eyes, but I felt like it was staring at me. I was in full panic mode at this point. I saw a flicker of color, and suddenly I realized I was staring into a pair of glowing red eyes. We held contact for what seemed like hours, when I felt movement in my body again. I snapped out of it, jumped out of the bed and ran down the hall to my sister's room where my parents were asleep. I knocked frantically on their door, calling for my mum. The knocking turned to pounding, and my call turned to yelling for my parents to let me in. I never turned back towards the room. I was too afraid to see those eyes peering through the doorway or seeing it stalking me. They opened the door, confused at the sight of their 22-year-old daughter crying and screaming in the middle of the night. They questioned me, but I made up a lie, as I knew they'd think I was having a nightmare or I was just exaggerating. I told them that I thought someone was trying to break in through the window, but that didn't make sense either, since we were on a second story, but I stuck to it. My dad went to check, and of course found nothing. Needless to say, I opted to sleep in the floor of their room with my parents for the rest of our stay. I don't know what it was and I can't explain it, but it was definitely a traumatizing experience that I still struggle with. Did I get a visit from a shadow person, ghost, demon? Or was it just all a dream? I work as a nurse in a psychiatric unit, which is conveniently tucked away around the back of an old hospital. I'm on night shift at the moment, and most of the night is trying to convince manic patients to return to their bed. We were having a strangely quiet night. The staff usually sit in the corridor at the intersection between the male and female sides of the ward. We can hear everything that's going on better from there and intervene quicker if needs be. There's a shower room located just to the left of where we sit. It has a toilet, a short wall partition separating the showers in the far corner of the room. As we were sitting there, the door to the shower room slowly crept open. No big deal. We got up, closed it again, and went on with the night. It happened again, about an hour later, and again we thought nothing of it. After closing the door a second time though, we soon heard the sounds of running water. I got up to check and found a tap in the shower room was running. I thought it must have been faulty, but when we tried to turn it off, it spun easily and stopped running water. Feeling a little bit freaked out, I checked around the partition to the shower in case a patient was somehow hiding there, but no one was there. When I turned to walk back out, I felt a sudden chill on the back of my neck and heard what sounded like gas hissing behind me. I glanced back around and checked the shower, which seemed to be working fine, and just assumed there was trapped air or something. The next night we were sitting in the same place, and again, it was an unusually quiet night, until around 2 a.m, when we heard a massive bang and then a dull thud, as if something had hit against a wall and then slid to the floor. The noise seemed to be quite close, and we hurriedly looked through each dormitory and individual patient room, expecting that one of the patients had fallen, but everyone was still asleep apart from one patient, who told us she had trouble sleeping the last few nights and asked to watch some television in the sitting room. We continued with our search, but couldn't seem to find anything to explain the sound, and sat back down in the corridor where we started to talk about ghosts and joking about being haunted. The patient who couldn't sleep asked if she could smoke in the toilet. We occasionally let people do this during the night, as we aren't allowed to let them out the unit after 10 p.m, and trying to tell an avid smoker they can't have a cigarette is a sure way to start a fight that'll cause everyone to wake up. We said she could have a quick one in the shower room before going back to bed, and she asked if one of us could come with her. When we asked why, she explained, "Because that room freaks me out. There are spirits in there that are trying to come through the mirrors." We heard stuff like this from patients on a regular basis, so we didn't think much of it. We offered her some reassurance, and I agreed to come into the bathroom with her. While we were in there, she talked about seeing the ghost of a man in her room, which kept her up at night. She then stopped talking abruptly and looked confused before going over to peer around the partition. I asked her what was wrong, and she shushed me and asked in a whisper if I heard what she'd heard. I admitted I couldn't hear anything. Again, this is a common occurrence for people who talk about auditory hallucinations on our ward, but asked her what she heard. She said she thought she could hear a dripping sound, but there was no water running, and when she checked behind the partition she heard a hissing sound. I suggested she finish her cigarette and get back to bed, and she asked for some medication to calm her down, then said, "Man, I hate that bathroom. The doors open and close by themselves, you know." After she went back to bed, I was telling the other staff about this, and we were all joking about how much of a freaky coincidence it all was. We were still discussing it when the day staff came in. When the first nurse arrived, she came over to ask how the shift was, and we asked her if she believed in ghosts in a jokey way. She said she didn't, but that she had bad memories of the ward that sometimes freak her out. She told us the worst thing she ever saw was 20 years ago when she was doing the hourly checks on the ward once, just to check on each patient every hour to make sure they're okay. She couldn't find one patient, so she went into the shower room because she could hear water running in there. She checked around the partition and found the guy lying dead in a pool of blood. He'd hacked himself to death with 2 blades, and he was obviously a very unwell man. The nurse told us that ever since that happened, a few times she's gone into the shower room and felt a sudden rush of cold air, as if someone was trying to run past her. I might need to start looking for a new job. To start the story off, for context, I absolutely despise bugs of all kind. Oh, Of course, I loved them as a child, but over the years, from being bitten by every local bug imaginable, I began to despise them. Since I was raised in the South, I had fallen victim to fire ants, and I seemed to give off a certain scent that attracts every mosquito and flea from miles around. But what did I hate the most? Roaches. Such disgusting creatures, the way they look, the way they move. Safe to say I had an intense phobia of them. I inherited a house from my dead grandmother in my late teens, and since it had been abandoned for about a year. That's right, you guessed it. It had become infested with large water bugs. Sleeping in the house was a nightmare, since occasionally the bugs found their way onto my bed. I could even hear them crawling in the walls at night. To cut a long story short, I went to extreme measures to eliminate them from my new home, and the war lasted a few years at least. One night after spraying and fighting with these pests, I retired for the night, thoroughly creeped out. That night I went to bed and had one of the most vivid and disturbing nightmares of my entire life. I remember that me and my family were traveling, and we couldn't find a motel. This was a common occurrence with my family anyway, and they usually would wait until late at night only to find run-down cheap motels. After arguing what to do, we came across an abandoned-looking building, and my family decided that this was where we were going to stay. I guess because it was free? I voiced my complaints, but their decision was adamant. As we walked inside, it ended up being my old apartment building from childhood. Except the entire place was in ruins, as if hundreds of years had passed and the building was barely left standing. Deep cracks could be seen all over the walls, as well as large holes in the flooring. Dirt was everywhere, and both small patches of grass and vines were beginning to invade the building through these holes. I remember wondering just what in the hell happened to this place, since it did carry sentimental value after all. An overall feeling of depression and dread could be felt in every room as I explored, like some sort of curse had taken over these walls. When I went into what was my old bedroom, I saw the haunting image of my original bed as a child still there, except it was just as dirty as the rest of the apartment. The rest of the apartment is empty, but what is my bed still doing here, I wondered. I did my best to shake the dust from the sheets since we were apparently stuck sleeping here. I complained a few more times, but my father shouted and insisted that I lay down and close my eyes, so I did. I don't remember any form of electricity being in the apartment, but suddenly everything went dark. Only a dim glow could be seen emanating from moonlight shining through the holes and cracks in the walls. Suddenly small bugs could be felt crawling on me. I wasn't surprised by this at all considering the environment, so I just shook them off and tried to ignore it. This kept happening, and eventually, I had had enough. I jumped out of bed only to discover a far worse situation that I could imagine. Bugs everywhere. Green caterpillars all over the floor, spiders, and of course roaches everywhere too. I lost my mind. I ran into the other room with my parents, screaming that I wanted to leave now. At first they ignored me, but as these large bugs that I had never seen before began emerging from the cracks, emitted a screeching sound, they finally jumped up and decided it was time to leave as well. We packed our things as fast as we could, but when we went to the exit, a large group of screaming roaches approached our way. We weren't able to get through them. They moved with lightning speed as they ran all over the room, in and out of the cracks. One of the strange bugs I couldn't identify earlier bit me, and I let out a scream as I stomped on it, turning it into a pile of goo. Several more approached us, and all I can say is that they appeared like praying mantises, but different. We had no other choice but to fight. We went around stomping on whatever got close to us, while fighting off some of the flying bugs with our hands, and still occasionally getting bitten in the process. A swarm of flying bugs surrounded my face, and I fell backwards while trying to fight them off. That was when I saw what I can truly say was the most horrifying image I'd ever seen. I sat up and saw a large, roundish centipede-like creature emerging from a large hole. The creature was red, and not nearly as long as any normal centipede, but still had many legs. The creature crawled onto a large rock, and as its backside was visible, I saw the human face of an old man on its back. The human face was actually part of the creature, centered with dozens of legs attached to the side of its face. The face looked right at me, and its expression was contorted in pain as it made a light screeching sound, the same sound that someone makes when they're being choked, as if it had been human at one point and was left doomed to spend the rest of its life and existence in agony on this creature's back. Thankfully, I immediately woke up after this, but felt very disturbed. I couldn't get the image out of my mind for weeks. And since I'm an artist, I feel the need to paint that image onto canvases. I think it's a way of me confronting my fear. Even as I painted this, I felt the image come into place. A true déjà vu feeling. The picture hangs on my bedroom, and as time passed, I am no longer afraid of it. It has become my favorite of all my art creations, and the one I am most proud of. Something that truly came out of my head, and mine alone. I work at a place with 5 floors and a basement. It used to be houses for nuns and priests. I got called up for a night shift since a colleague called in sick. I'd never done a night shift there, so I took the opportunity to see what it was like. 4th floor. Doing your rounds isn't the creepiest thing at all. The creepiest thing is going down the stairs again. You see a black figure walking in the hallway, just your average shadow, you know. The thing is, the lift sometimes randomly goes to that floor during the night, as if someone's calling it. On the 3rd floor, doing your rounds gets a little weirder, since here it seems as though you aren't alone whilst you visit the floor. You see shadows on the walls passing you, as well as hear footsteps. The 2nd floor is exactly the same as the 3rd, except for a painting. It has a woman, and it sometimes changes positions, or even completely vanishes. On the 1st floor, you sometimes hear the piano play, a D on the floor above you. Just that one random note. On the main floor, there is a black leather couch in the hallway, where you will sometimes find a see-through man with a cigar and newspaper. He smiles and will completely vanish just as you go to greet him. In the basement, there are helpful poltergeists. This is the place where, before my current company took up the building, the morgue was. There's currently our storage rooms, but the rooms aren't marked with what's in them. But that doesn't matter, because the night shift refills and gets knocks on the doors to indicate where the items are. It's definitely an interesting place to work. When I was a little kid, about 6, I started having this recurring nightmare that follows me still to this day. I'm 17 now for reference. The nightmare took place in a dark castle, the type that you'd see in a horror movie and know instantly it was haunted. I was walking down a corridor of the castle with my mum and sister when we were passing a painting of a tea party. One of the people in the painting, a tall, pale man dressed in all black, stood up and turned to us, beckoning for my mother to follow him. My sister and I tried to stop her, tried to hold her back, but she didn't even seem to notice us. My mother entered the painting and walked further into it, arm in arm with the strange man. My sister and I decided that we needed to find her, but as we searched through the castle, we got separated. I don't know how long I was looking, but I do know that I found my mum, as well as the most traumatizing part of this dream. I stumbled onto the castle's throne room, and it was the most disturbing thing I'd ever seen. The whole room was bathed in red, fiery light that was emanating from a huge fireplace behind the throne that a man from the painting was sitting on, as well as from a gaping hole in the wall that was closing and opening in intervals. There was a huge crowd of people in the throne room. I knew that if they saw me, they would hurt me. So I crept through the shadows on the edge of the throne room until I was just under the hole in the wall. I could hear bits and pieces of conversation from the people gathered around, but nothing made sense. The worst part is that going into the hole in the wall was a conveyor belt style operation, with large metal hooks going down from it, like in a meat processing plant. While that might not be terribly scary, the really messed up part was that hanging from these hooks were all of my loved ones, and they were all alive. To make matters worse, I knew that my family and friends were being drained of their blood and then burnt in that hole. My best friend at the time was just about to go into the fiery hole when he looked directly down at me and gasped, "You caused this?" with a look of betrayal and accusation. I was so shocked I couldn't move. As he was being drawn into the hole, I overheard a group of older women laughing and talking about what a shame it was they couldn't get the full set before one of them caught sight of me and grabbed me. It was at that moment I awoke. All the guards at my workplace know the theatre is haunted. We're all used to the super eerie feelings down there in the lower levels, like the backstage areas. Most of it can be passed off as long work hour stress, but there is definitely some evil stuff in this building with us. It's probably an entity that latched itself onto the themes of theatrics and whatnot. We got all kinds of stories. We've all heard the grand piano playing on its own in the night, heard ghostly voices arguing every now and then as we walk through the halls. Sometimes I smell a harsh burning in the halls at night, like sulfur. We all know that doesn't mean well. Tonight has been the worst it's ever been. I heard a door slam shut nearby as I was patrolling, and as a joke, I yelled out, "Who it be?" It's an inside joke with me and my friends to lighten my nerves, and I heard a deep, almost unintelligible male voice saying, "It be me." Sounds kind of funny, but I didn't enjoy that. My Bluetooth earphones blatantly refused to work tonight, and I also walked through one of the function halls in darkness. Once the building closes, we patrol without many lights on, other than the occasional safety lights here and there, and I saw something following me into a mirror. I refused to look behind me or stare at the mirror for too long, but it appeared to be a figure, clearly dressed in a costume of a king, with a fur robe and a black, jagged crown. Its head was tilting side to side as it shuffled along beside me, kind of like a key-winded toy. It moved so soundlessly, and as you can imagine, I was pretty startled. I couldn't feel my legs out of dread, so I didn't even stop walking. I just stopped looking immediately, and kept calm, walked out the room, and pretended to see nothing. I think this is happening due to the current performance of a real old and famous play called Faust. A very famous actor died performing it in Melbourne a long time ago in another nearby theatre, and his ghost allegedly haunts that theatre till this day. It's not too far down the road from our theatre. There's also a secret warehouse on site, the location of which, for obvious reasons, we do not share with the public. But this warehouse is basically a storage room full of old, valuable artifacts that have to do with early modern theatre and music. Authentic historical pieces like an 18th century instrument, and old chests/trunks that belong to people of fame. One-of-a-kind tapes recorded by famous rock and blues musicians. Old stage set models, some dating back all the way to the 1800s. Crazy stuff. I know for a fact that some of these old artifacts bring with them the presence of beings potentially older than them. You couldn't pay me to open up some of these creepy-looking trunks. Safe to say, I'm glad I'm casual now and no longer work full-time. I've been working here for almost a year. It's hands down the most haunted place I've ever experienced. When I was 16, my best friend and next-door neighbor ended her life on January 21st, 2006. Every night after that, I would either dream of her entirely, or she would intrude in my other dreams. I remember a dream about a dance recital once where everyone was dancing. She was in the back dancing with a rope around her neck. The dream wasn't about her, but she was there nonetheless. Very unpleasant stuff. It made my grief so much harder to get through. However, it was pretty clear those dreams were just that, dreams. I wasn't frightened, nor was I in any way denying that it was my obvious subconscious thoughts, that I dreamed her every single night. On December 31st, 2006, I went to bed. I remember that I dreamed that night that my friend and I were in a field of wildflowers. There was so much sunlight that everything was white, and we were holding hands and she was smiling. We laid down next to each other and I was looking at her. We were silent for a while, and very serenely I asked her, "Were you in pain?" The sound of the field was replaced by this progressive loud ringing until it was so loud my teeth hurt. She answered silently. I watched her face go from smiling to clenching her teeth, turning red, and her face changing until she looked like she was in so much pain. She grasped my hand in hers so hard her fingernails dug into it, and I woke up a few minutes later, turned on the light to see if there was a mark, and of course there wasn't. But that dream felt incredibly different than the others I'd ever had. So vivid, so raw. Point is, I never dreamed of her again after that. I got over her death and put my grief to rest. I'm 27 now, and it's been 12 years. This happened when I was 17. I'm 24 now, and all started with a road trip my classroom did in high school. I don't really remember where, but it was a 3-day trip, and I was carrying a big backpack with a lot of unnecessary souvenirs and clothes, so it was super heavy. We were coming back in the bus and my mum called me to say she was with my father. When we were reaching the city I live in, the teacher told us that the driver could let us get off the bus if we were close to our homes, so that we didn't have to go all the way to school. We were reaching a part of the city I thought was close to my father's house, where I thought my mum was, so I asked the driver to stop, and off I went. It was only when the bus was gone that I realized I was wrong, and didn't know this part of the city, and my phone battery was dying. I called my mum, asking her if she could pick me up, but she told me she was in a restaurant across the city, because she thought she would pick me up near my school. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared and lost, so my reckless and very stupid young brain told her to wait there and that I would walk to a nearby subway or bus station and go to the restaurant, even though I had no idea where I was, so I started walking. I was lost, tired, and my back was in pain because of the heavy backpack I was carrying, and started walking slower. My phone was dead. The city was darker, and I reached a part of the city that was not a good neighborhood. I was scared and in an empty street, but I was still thinking I could reach a subway or something and be safe, when suddenly I felt someone pulling my backpack and pulling me inside an old building. I was scared and paralyzed with fear until this man grabbed my hand, and I realized he wanted to pull me all the way inside. I still don't know how I did it, but I jumped, getting my hand out of his reach, and pushed him with my backpack, and used it to get my arms out of the bag and ran, crying and trying to find help. I'm not sure if the guy followed me or not, but I ran until I felt like I was going to pass out and reached a big avenue. Just then I turned around and the guy wasn't there, and I felt momentarily relieved, only to remember that I didn't have my bag with me and was still lost, but now without money or a cell phone or anything for that matter. I asked a woman if she knew where the nearest subway was, and I think she saw how desperate I looked because she accompanied me all the way there and was kind enough to buy me a ticket after I explained to her what happened. When I arrived to where my mum was, she was super scared and wanted to call the police, but I wasn't able to tell her where exactly all of this went down. I don't want to think about what could have happened if I hadn't have been able to escape. When my son was about 6 months old, I had a dream that I was at my grandparents' house with him. My grandfather was holding my son and crying while I spoke with my grandmother. I told her that I wished her and my grandfather were still alive to see my son, and she said, "Don't worry, we see him." I didn't think anything else until 5 years later. I was talking to my sister, and I mentioned that I'd had a dream about my grandparents. She said, "Was Papa Joe," that's what we called our grandfather, "holding your son while he rocked in his chair? And did Grandma tell you they were watching you?" "Yes," I said. "How did you know that?" I had the same dream when my son was 6 months old. And more recently, my son, he was 20 at the time, was driving home from work late one night. As he drove, he said he very clearly heard my mother, who had been dead for 2 years, say, "Jonathan, stop the car." Out of reflex he did, and as soon as he stopped, 3 deer ran out in front of him. Had he not stopped the car, he'd have hit them. I believe in the paranormal, and it doesn't scare me, but this building is completely different. I've never had any place give me the heebie-jeebies like this place does. I will crank the heat up to 80, and it will say 78 in here, but my fingers will be so cold I can't type my logs up, and my nose will be so cold that it's running and aching. I hear people walking up and down the halls. It's night shift, and no one goes in or out without the door chimes going off. I've heard someone sneeze in the hallway outside my office. I hear chairs scrape across the floor in the squad room, and when I know I'm the only person in here. I've seen one apparition, a blonde-haired girl with grey sweats pulled up to her knees and a white button-up shirt, blonde hair with dark roots and white tennis shoes. I saw her plain as day, walk from the bathroom to the squad room with her hands up to her face. I literally thought someone was in the building and called an officer in. There was only one way in and out, and I don't know how she didn't go past me. We found no one. Now I work for a tribunal police department in Oklahoma, so this was all Indian land at some point, but that wouldn't explain the girl I saw. I work the night shift, and I've learned the normal sounds of the building, like the ice machine or the wind blowing through the attic. But some nights this place just gives me the icy chills, just that feeling that you shouldn't be here. I've heard my name being called, and I mean my first name, but I go by my middle name, so very few people know my real name. We have a couple who are terrified to work the night shift by themselves, so here I sit. Now every other place I've worked, I've always had the same little, what I call Fred pranks, where my drink or pen will disappear, but I find it somewhere weird later on. Someplace I hadn't yet even been in the building. But this place is just beyond creepy. I need to give you some background before I begin. I'm from a city in the northeast of Scotland in the UK. What happened here didn't just affect me, but also 2 close friends called Debbie and Joe. We all used to work for Virgin Megastore. I started there back in 2003, and Debbie joined in 2006, and Joe in 2007. The entire staff of the store, for the best part, were all close friends. We were all music and movie nerds, so shared the same interests and sense of humor. Every year over the Christmas period, we would take on temporary staff as extra help for the volume of customers we would get at the time of year. In 2007, one of our temps was Rory. Most of us hit it off with him brilliantly. Young guy, seemed really passionate about music, especially Pink Floyd, which he was a big fan of, especially with Joe, who was one of the greatest guitarists I've ever met, and myself who grew up on Pink Floyd through my parents. Plus, Rory was a budding filmmaker, and his love of movies seemed to match his love of music, so we would have a lot to chat about, and became friends very quickly. It was rare to keep in touch with the work temps post the Christmas period, but Rory was an exception. He didn't live in the same city as the rest of us, but kept plenty of contact through text and social media, and would come through the city to hang out from time to time. Move forward to Christmas 2008. By this point, Virgin Megastore had become Zavvi Entertainment, and Rory came back to work with us as a temp, in particular with me. I ran the stockroom in the store, which was the busiest place at Christmas time, and had a history of not great people for help. So I was happy to be getting someone I knew would work hard, and that I could have banter with. He could be a bit annoying trying to force different live versions of the same Pink Floyd song he found on the internet. As I said, I love Pink Floyd, but I love a lot of music too. Nevertheless, I figured, he's young and passionate, but he's cool. Around this time, he started to put together a self-made Pink Floyd documentary, which he interviewed me and Joe for. And to be honest, he did a really great job, given the limitation and tools he had. Zavvi closed in February 2009 due to the global credit crunch at the time. All Zavvi staff and Rory kept in touch. We'd all become very close working there, like I said. Fast forward to summer 2010. We had a Zavvi reunion night out, which Rory organized. Most of us that still lived in the same city managed to make it along. Joe had moved to Glasgow at this point, and it was a really fun night out, and Rory stayed at my place. I should also point out, Rory was preparing to go to America for his second year working as a camp counselor for Camp America at Camp Wigwam in Maine, Ohio. Since Zavvi closed, I'd gotten a new job doing the same thing at another entertainment retail store, and that Christmas, Rory came to work there as a temp, which I was initially fine with. Moving into 2011, and Rory starts to raise red flags, although at the time I didn't see it clearly. He claimed that while in America, he'd gotten a job helping with editing and camera work on the show Burn Notice. At the time I was like, oh wow man, that's cool, well done. It didn't seem unbelievable, given I knew he had a talent in filmmaking. To coincide with this, he claimed he was working for Camp America in Florida, which is what led him to be working on Burn Notice, where it was filmed at the time. Then, when he was back in Scotland in 2011, it was time for another work Zavvi reunion, which Rory had to be in charge of, which bothered me since he technically didn't work there when we closed, and like I said, he was only a temp. I got sickened with him posting constantly on Facebook about essentially what was just some old friends going to the pub. Again, I was like, yeah, he's young and easily excited, but harmless though. Then another red flag was raised. Rory and another friend who shared an interest in filmmaking were talking about doing a film in the city. They spent the whole day looking for a location, and afterwards, when I spoke to Rory, he was like, yeah, we're gonna go do this and this, making it sound like they had some exciting ideas. Then when I spoke to my other friend about it, he said, all Rory did for the whole day was ask me what my favorite directors were. It was a complete waste of time. Made me think, he's young and excitable but has a tendency to exaggerate. Move into 2012, Debbie, who I mentioned earlier, became a close figure in his life. Debbie is nearly 6 foot tall, a blonde bombshell, and at the time one of the nicest people you could ever meet, with an amazing sense of humor. We became super close when we worked together, but it was always totally platonic. I always looked at her in more of a sibling way. She would come around to my place for dinner and to watch movies, and I knew all of her close friends and a few family members. Herself and Rory went to the cinema a few times and hung out afterwards. Absolutely nothing wrong with that, for now. Move on to Christmas. Rory's back as a temp for the 3rd year in a row, and by this time he has started to annoy the other staff. While on lunch, he'd sit and brag about all the TV shows he worked on during his summer in the States. Burn Notice, Criminal Minds, and The Wire. Unfortunately, I didn't hear about it this time because people knew I was friendly with him, so they didn't want to seem like they were talking crap about him. As the staff in this job also got along famously. On a personal note, talking with him at work became a bit weird. He started to talk to me in a really smug and condescending tone, which, given I'm 6 years older than the dude and had a hand in him getting him his temp jobs every year, and me thinking I was his friend, didn't appreciate it. Then around the same time, there's another Zavvy night out due. Rory, Debbie and Joe, who was visiting from Glasgow, myself and a few others. The day before I said, get together, keep in mind I'm already pissed about how Rory is behaving, I get a text from him saying how, hey man, the plan for the night out tomorrow is to go to a pub quiz, your favourite. Now, I don't go to pub quizzes for tedious personal reasons. All of these friends know this, so Rory was essentially implying the rest of the guys had planned to go to something I wouldn't go to. Which I didn't, as I was super pissed about that text. I kept quiet about it from the others, even though I should have just shown how devious he was, because as it turns out those guys didn't do a pub quiz and there was no intention to. The next day comes, and Joe comes into the shop to speak with me since I'd missed the night out. The whole time I'm talking to him, Rory is standing there in a defensive stance answering everything I asked Joe, like he was his spokesperson, which was infuriating because I was at work. I couldn't let him get under my skin, and Joe is happy-go-lucky and didn't even notice what Rory was doing. Rory was obsessed with Joe because of his talents as a guitar player, to the point of becoming unhealthy. It was around the time that Debbie started to sense I was having a problem with Rory, and it was true. Contact with him would trigger me to get anxious or angry, because I knew there was something amiss, but Debbie and Joe were constantly fooled by his false charm. And that's why I kept tolerating him, because I loved those guys and didn't want to be the cause of any unnecessary drama in the workplace. In early 2013, Rory makes out that his dad had a life-threatening stroke, which he survives, but leaves him incredibly disabled. This subsequently turns out to be a lie and a tool to get sympathy from Joe and Debbie. Moving forward to 2014, Joe moves back to town from Glasgow into Debbie's spare room, and this is where Rory really starts to phase me out of the group. Despite having recently hung out with me, and me having put up with him at my place, which I've done several times over the years at this point, he takes Debbie, Joe, and another ex-Zabby friend to 3 different price gigs all around the country. Initially I was super pissed, but in hindsight I was relieved. It was Rory that paid for all the tickets for those gigs, which was another red flag. Have to point out that, for when he wasn't working with me as a temp over Christmas or in America over the summer, working for Camp America and various TV shows, he was making out that he was a freelance photographer and video editor, which would be fine, but he didn't have a website, Facebook page or anything else as far as anyone could see to contact him and do work. Taking that into account, and the fact that he's throwing cash to go to concerts around the UK, I started to grow suspicious about where his money was coming from. Following the Prince gigs, I had blocked him on social media, as his posts and comments on other people's posts were just annoying, constantly undermining people on what they're saying or arguing with folks having different opinions to him. Debbie took issue with me blocking him and stuck up for him, which, in hindsight, she'd been groomed by him and had rose-tinted glasses on when looking at him. I caved and got back in touch with him, even though I now know I should have walked away from them all. But like I said before, I dearly loved Debbie and Joe, and didn't want to lose their friendship, despite everything I knew and had seen. Throughout 2014, Debbie and Rory got super close. Anyone that didn't know them seeing Facebook pics would think they were a couple. Over the next 2 years, my contact with these guys started to drift. Rory would come to my place for a bit, and then would be like, well, I'm away up to darling Debbie's. I would invite you, but you're not one of the 3 amigos. A lot of the time, he wasn't actually going there, it would turn out. He would come to my place to stay the night once, saying he needed to catch a flight to the States in the morning to get a video editing job, Then it would turn out he was just going back to the village he lived in at his mum's house. Eventually, I walked away quietly. I took Debbie, Joe, and Rory off newsfeed and hid any Facebook posts I made hidden from them. I figured if I'd see them on the street, I'd be polite, but I just tried to get away from them ASAP, figuratively trying to close the chapter of the book. I then started to investigate Rory's claims about his time in America. I relayed them all to a friend and his flatmate, who himself had lived in America for a long time. They both told me, "Nah man, there's no way he could be doing all that." Which is true. If you go to America to work for Camp America, that's all you're allowed to do. And with a bit of research, I found the camp Rory actually worked at, providing he never did Camp America work in Florida. During this time, I had friends who would still follow him on Facebook out of intrigue. They would ask me, where is his money coming from? Rory was going to stadium and arena concerts around the UK at least once a week. Some of those gigs costing as much as £200 a ticket, not to mention travel costs and accommodation. I knew something was up. I knew he wasn't involved in drugs. He would claim he'd made money from YouTube, but his channel barely had any subscribers, and all his videos were copyrighted material, so there's no way he could make anything on that. I did wonder if he was making money from editing. He was avoiding paying tax, that's for sure. Believe me, if I could have afforded a private investigator, I would have definitely asked him to check out this guy. During all this time, Debbie and Joe were just hanging out and posting how great he is on Facebook, despite the fact I found Rory had a second Facebook account where the profile pic was of him and Debbie. This was a secret account, and I took a screenshot and showed Debbie, but she's just like, "Oh, that's his American account." Fast forward to October 2018. By this point, I've severed contact with Rory completely. Missed Debbie's wedding the previous year where Rory was bridesman, and haven't seen Joe in a good while either. I'm back at work after lunch for about 5 minutes, then my friend who was on her lunch and in the staff room comes running through to where I am. "Hey, have you heard that Rory was in court?" Which in itself was totally shocking. I was like, "What? For tax evasion or copyright infringement?" "No, for making videos of little kids." Between January and November 2017, he was pretending to be a girl online using YouTube and Omegle to groom young boys. Once I was told what he'd done, I was in an adrenaline-fueled rage for the next 17 hours. Just so pissed off that I'd been right that he was a bad guy but couldn't prove it. I knew my friends had been duped, not to mention all those poor kids. As for his expendable income, I really think he was selling the videos that he was making on the dark web for Bitcoin profit. He was the first person to ever mention the dark net to me, but in a way of like, "Oh, never go on the dark net." He pleaded guilty, got 3 years and 9 months, along with 5 years harm and prevention order, and will be on the offenders register for the rest of his life. Thanks for listening. I'm still in touch with Joe, although he's super busy these days. I'm not in touch with Debbie anymore, sadly. I know she was mortified by the revelations, but she's married and happy, so I'm glad she just saw the truth eventually, even though it took something so heinous for her to see it. I've only had sleep paralysis once in my life, and it was terrifying. I had woken from a deep sleep and was completely aware of everything. I could feel the blanket laying on me and the exact position I was laying in. What scared me was the presence I felt hanging over me at the foot of my bed. It was heavy and dark. I was panicking and trying my hardest to move. I kept thinking, "I need to move," over and over, and I passed out. I didn't immediately remember what happened in the morning. The memory came back later that day, and I discussed it with some of my work friends, and their opinions ranged from normal to paranormal. I was little on the fence to which it was, but I was scared to sleep for a while. A few weeks later, I was drifting off to sleep when I felt the presence again. This time it was beside my bed. I was facing away from it, and went stiff, hoping it would go away. It took me a few minutes to get the courage to flip around. When I did, I caught a very clear view of it before it vanished. It was a dark shape that almost resembled a human, but wasn't solid enough in shape. I didn't sleep well the rest of the night. I told my best friend about it. That's when I learnt what it was. Shades feed off your energy. They're drawn to negative emotions like stress and anxiety, which mine were very high at the time. She's a witch and brought me a bottle that contained Himalayan sea salt, rose petal, and a few other things. I only saw it once after that. I was trying to sleep but still very awake. I opened my eyes and saw it, as clear as the other time before it vanished again. I hadn't felt its presence, and I believe it was my friend's concoction that kept it away. It's been about a year since that happened, and I think it actually got rid of it. When I first started escorting, I was completely clueless. I was desperate and usually would text with someone who got my number off a site and arranged a meeting. These guys were usually married and couldn't go to their place, so we would do car dates. Real cheap stuff, before I knew what kind of money I would be making. Save the judgment because it's my job. Anyway, I get this text from a guy a few weeks in. He's early 40s, single, and he said he'd love to meet me, but just seems way too into it. But desperate times, so I decide to meet with him. I let someone know where I'm going and walk out of my apartment and to the back of the complex to meet him. I knew enough to know I didn't want him to know where I lived. He's not the guy in the pictures, but that happens. These guys want discreet. We go to the hotel, I start to undress, and he stops me. We sit on the bed, and he tells me he wants me comfortable. I'm a tiny 5'4", 120-pound woman. Anyone could honestly take me. He climbs on top of me and pulls a knife out in front of my face. It's my knife. He slid it out my pocket. What's this for? Do you think you need it? It wouldn't have helped. If I want to hurt you, I definitely could. I'm freaked the hell out at this point. I'm pinned under this guy who's really short, but has a marine background and about 125 pounds on me. We finish the deed, and I clean myself up and get dressed. Our time's been up, but he keeps himself between me and the door. It's hella uncomfortable, as he keeps telling me about things he could do to me if he wanted to, and that he could get away with it. I eventually make it home and say that I won't be seeing that one again. But weeks go by and I'm desperate and ended up having 3 to 4 dates with this guy, and he got increasingly creepier and more possessive. I ended up telling him to lose my number and had to block him. Some of these men walking among us are truly psychos. And Ray Ray, let's not meet again. I've always had vivid dreams, but these few I remember when I was a kid are more weird. I was 6 to 8 when these started. I do have very vivid dreams, but none of these have ever felt the same. As I was young, I don't remember all the details, but the gist is that I would dream about a woman in a white dress, in her mid-20s I'd say. She was younger and had smooth arms. I could never see her face, but there was a man with her every time. He had blonde brown hair, a full beard, and I could see his face. He was dressed in white too. Pretty much normal humans, and we would be in the woods sometimes behind my house. After the first dream, I started having weird things happen in my sleep. Like one time I woke up. Well, I thought I was, but I couldn't move. But I knew I was being moved, and somehow I was under my bed, which wasn't that high off the ground, and had containers in front of me that had to move in order to get under my bed. Something was moving me, and I had no control. The dreams would continue for a year or more. I was still very young, but the last one happened. I remember being in the woods, and the woman and the man were there, and they were standing on the deck of a ship about to walk aboard, and there were lights, very bright. I think other people were on that ship. and I felt a presence but don't remember seeing anything this time. My whole family was there and the neighbors, which we were related to, meeting, and they were telling us thanks and goodbye. I have no idea why they seemed very grateful and never dreamed of them again. I'm just really curious if anyone has had these types of dreams or even seen these two in their sleep. I've always been curious but never found an answer. I was 16 at a house party with a good friend, another girl. There were some gatecrashers who turned up, which isn't unusual at London house parties, but these guys were older, and there was just a vibe. A girl I vaguely know who was drunk and being surrounded by them, and I asked her if she was okay, and she told me to piss off. I looked at my friend and said, "I'm going to call my mum and dad to get me. Do you want a lift?" My parents were amazing and said to me that if I was at a party or out for any reason and didn't want to be there, I would call them and they'd always come to get me. My parents turned up, coats on over pajamas, and took us both home. Apparently half hour after we left, someone was stabbed. The girl we had asked earlier was assaulted and lots of stuff was stolen and people were beaten up and held up at knife point. I had such a feeling in the air that I've hardly felt before or since, and knew that we shouldn't be there. I used to make friends with security guards on my secondary school while I was schooling, and they'd always share creepy stories. One of the stories was about the computer lab. So the computers in the lab will turn on and off by themselves after school hours, and there was no one around. So at first the guard thought that a teacher who conducted classes earlier forgot to check, so he turned them off one by one. After he went back to the guard post and checked through the CCTV and made sure everything was okay, he saw the computers turn on one by one on their own. Another one is when I will stay awake till 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning playing computer games. Since I live opposite my secondary school, I always like to stare out my windows just to see if I could spot anything that the rumors were telling me about. I did sort of find what I was looking for. It was weird. Every night at 2:30 a.m.-ish, there'd be an orange light that looked like flames but no smoke from one of the classrooms on the 3rd level. It would be burning for about half hour and was super consistent. It happened nearly every day, and I even told my sister about it, and she confirms she saw it. That's why I believe that places like office buildings and schools are common areas for things to stay, because technically the place belongs to no one, so the phantoms can claim them for themselves and just have some fun in the night. Get off me. I woke up saying those exact words after a few seconds, and I instantly remembered why I'd said that. I was having sleep paralysis. There was a woman in the corner of my room and she was simply standing there. I tried to move, to turn on my light, but she was weighing me down. I struggled until I finally saw her move. She started walking towards me and I tried calling out my sister's name. I felt like I was suffocating and just wanted it all to stop. The woman was one step away and I could finally see her. Her face, or lack of. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just long hair and sharp nails. She's climbing on top of me and began tearing away my skin. I tried screaming for help. I tried moving to push her off me, but nothing worked. But the weird thing is she started molesting me. She put her hands inside me and I couldn't take it anymore and I wanted it all to stop. I slowly started regaining a little bit of movement, as well as my ability to speak. Although I'm sure it didn't take me too long to wake up. It felt like centuries. As soon as I woke up, I looked to my right, which was where my window was, and there she was. She stood outside of my window until she suddenly vanished. This happened in 2017, and the next time I saw her was in 2018. Except, I moved to a different house. I visited Paris a few years back with a friend. We're both females in our 20s at the time, and we went for lunch at a restaurant and met some guy who presented himself as the owner of the place. While asking how the lunch was, he asked about our nationality, as it was easily understandable that we're not French. He then proceeded to tell us one of his best friends is from where we're from and was thrilled to let him know some girls from the same country were eating at his restaurant. He called this friend and passed his phone to me to talk to him. Nothing weird, usual stuff, and at the end he invited us to a party with live music, drinks and stuff. We thought why not? We didn't have plans for the evening, so we exchanged numbers and agreed to meet. My friend and I went to meet him at the address he gave us, which was at some abandoned place, no movement around. We got this scary vibe while waiting for him to show up. A car approaches us. It's him, a man in his 50s. He was very polite and apologized to us for waiting and tells us that we're not very far from the place. We get into his car, very afraid, but not wanting to show and act like everything's cool. We didn't know where we were going. He was telling us about his life, how he's been living in France for over 30 years, and how he missed our country so much. But work didn't allow him to take vacation, so he hasn't visited in years. He seemed normal, but my friend and I knew we messed up and it was too late. We couldn't even talk about how to get out of the situation. My friend was freaking out, so I told her to please stay calm. We arrive at this building, it's dark outside and we could see no party here. He apologized once again, saying the party was cancelled, but some of his friends are inside and that we could have some drinks, talk a little and he'll drive us to the hotel later. At this point I'd tell him we'd prefer to go back to our hotel and ask if it's possible to just drop us off at the nearest bus station. He insists that he really wants to spend some time just chatting with us and wants to order some drinks to make up for the party being cancelled. I tried to act as cool as possible, not wanting to offend him because I didn't know how he'd react. He kept begging for us to go inside and maybe cook something for us because I told him we were hungry. Hopefully he would agree to drive us to the hotel. It was 11 p.m. and we gave him a false hotel address, of course. I felt so relieved when I saw city lights again and we were out of his car. To this day, I can't believe how naive we were and fortunate that nothing happened. In my mid-20s, I was bouncing around. I couldn't settle on what to do, and after a long and crappy relationship, was mostly interested in having fun. I was at uni, but wasn't the most committed student. I had been working at a restaurant in a hotel, but hated it, and a friend told me about working as a receptionist in a brothel. It's completely legal where I live, and said the money was decent and it would fit well with uni. It wasn't difficult. If a client was rude, you just kick them out, unlike hospitality, where you need to be polite to them the whole time. I found a place that was looking for receptionists and went for an interview and got a job, and it was fine. I mean, it's not the most interesting job in the world, but it paid okay. I could smoke out back when cigarettes didn't cost $50 a pack, and I could study if I was quiet. And I know that everyone is thinking, receptionist is code for sex work, and I promise that it isn't. I have no proof, but lying about it doesn't make the story any more interesting. We had regular clients, and they all had reputations of some kind. This guy only books for half hour, but always extends his booking at least once. This guy will pay extra for dirty talk. A lot of it was innocuous, just information passed between people that we as receptionists always heard about. But some of it was along the lines of warnings. This guy will try and remove the protection. This guy wants to spank, but doesn't ask first. And then there was the doctor. The doctor had a lot of money and would potentially bring multiple workers in for a long time. He paid reasonably boring extras like fancy lingerie or fantasy roleplay, aka nurses' uniforms. But he had a real big red warning sign above his forehead. The first time he came in, one of the other receptionists warned me. No one has to do an intro with him if they don't want to. Warn the girls, it's the doctor. I called the intro, i.e. I went to the staff room and said, intro in meeting room 1. which generally meant that every available worker should go in, say their name, flirt, and after, one of the receptionists would find out who they wanted to see and for how long. And all the workers stood up and said, "It's the doctor," but all but two sat down. So immediately I asked what the deal is, and they explained that he likes coke. He likes workers who like it or pretend to like it. He's a neurosurgeon who gets access to strange drugs, and often his is far from pure. He also enjoys drug insertion, and he was just creepy. When we'd go into checks with him, he'd try to grab us, make us, the receptionists, sit down, and to be clear, I'm not what people would consider attractive. Plus, he'd do it with all the receptionists. He'd grab our hands and try to stroke our arms. He had this super intense stare, like a mannequin that could make eye contact. It's hard to describe. It was like he was staring right back at you, but without seeing you. His expressions were weird and just didn't work on his face. Like his mouth would smile or move, but his eyes wouldn't change from that intense stare. I guess it might have been all the coke, but it was deeply unsettling and just made you feel sick. Having said that, there were a few experienced workers who knew how to handle him, get the most out of him while experiencing the least possible risk, like fake snorting, hence giving workers the option to meet the clients. I can't remember if he saw anyone that first time. If I recall correctly, he had a handful of bookings in at the time while I was working there. We did have strict instructions to never let anyone do an out-call with him. That is booking at anywhere other than the brothel. Plus, we had a few other harm minimization strategies. Then after a while, one of the workers who was okay with seeing him left to go travel, and no one else would go see him. So he gradually stopped coming, as no one would intro him. I moved on to the receptioning at a different brothel. A new one had opened closer to where I was living and paid better, and he showed up there again. I knew he would frequent all the places he could until his reputation preceded him. When he showed up at the new place, I told all the workers about him, and no one was okay with seeing him. He tried only a few more times until he abandoned us. A year or so later, I had moved on to a different job. I couldn't do night shifts anymore, and I was chatting with a friend from the brothel who said, "Oh my god, did you hear about the doctor? He killed someone and got arrested." And it was true. The doctor had killed a worker who had been sent to his apartment. The worker lay dead in his bed for 2 days. Officially it was manslaughter, and he also pleaded guilty to supplying the drug that killed another worker. All of this happened because he's a terrible dumpster fire human, and also because of one awful brothel manager and the owners behind her. But profit in front of safety and kept sending workers to bookings with him without giving them full warnings, and specifically sending inexperienced workers, and without keeping them in-house. It later came out that the medical board had known of his addiction for many years prior to his arrest and had helped cover up some botched surgeries. It was horrifying to hear about, and we both spent time telling stories we knew about him, but then I mostly forgot about it. Then I was chatting with an old friend the other day who reminded me of it, and I got him from Google. I found out he's now been released from prison, and I really hope he's not practicing medicine anymore. My grandmother had passed away about a week prior, and I was sleeping in bed when I suddenly woke up. My grandma was standing at the door. I knew it couldn't be because she was obviously deceased. I didn't move, and she slowly began to glide towards me. She reached down, touched my feet, and said, "Everything's gonna be okay, mijo." It was strangely calm, and she just glided back. Knowing this was impossible, I assumed that it was a dream, so in an attempt to check reality, I reached over and unplugged my alarm clock, plugged it back in, and went back to sleep. The next morning, my mum woke me up, and when I checked the time, it was flashing 3:17. It was actually 7:30. I was strangely okay with the anomaly, and accepted the fact that my dead grandma stopped in to say, "What's up?" This happened when I was in middle school. It was summer, and I was taking a break from riding my bike around my neighborhood, outside a friend's house, when I saw this red pickup truck with a bronze stripe pull over to a stop near me. The passenger and driver were both white males with sandy blonde hair and white tank tops and baseball caps. They claimed to be lost and looking for directions to somewhere, but since I didn't know, I said, "Sorry, can't help you." The entire time, alarm bells are going off in my head, and I move farther away from the truck and into my friend's yard, hoping she and her mother would come home. They kept wanting me to help them and monitoring me to come closer to the vehicle. I just kept repeating I didn't know where it was as I continued to back up into the yard. Eventually they gave up and left, and once I could no longer see their truck, I pedaled back home as fast as I could. There was another occasion something creepy happened. I was followed home from the supermarket by a dark green pickup truck. Once I came to a stop at my house, which I know is a bad move, but I figured I was being paranoid, he pulled up behind me and motioned for me to get out of my car. I didn't, and stayed there. The guy started talking to me and asking me questions about my license plate. Apparently, it was very similar to a club he belonged to, which turned out to be some sort of uber-conservative militia. He finally left, and I didn't leave my car until I was sure he was gone. My parents and cousin were upset that I didn't call the cops about being followed. So was I, but I didn't want to call them on a false alarm. And for the next few days I kept my eyes open for the truck. And to this day I'm still paranoid sometimes about someone following me home from the supermarket. I once woke up at night and there was this figure standing next to my bed. It looked like a small boy, maybe 5 years old, wearing one of those old-timey sailor suits that children used to get dressed up in the late 19th to early 20th century. The boy was semi-transparent and asked for help. If you think it sounded creepy so far, it got worse. I suddenly saw myself from another angle, with my eyes open, staring at the boy ghost, and my body rose up, and I said in a deep, unnatural voice, "Your soul is mine." And my mouth opened, wider than a human mouth should, more like a snake's mouth, and I swallowed the ghost. Then I woke up, thinking, wow, that was a rather creepy dream. Strangely enough, my stomach felt full, just as if I had eaten a good meal mere minutes before. It was 5 a.m. though, and I probably hadn't eaten since 1 a.m. like my post-midnight snack. That was a few years ago. Never experienced anything like it again. I do have to say I rarely have traditional nightmares. Was something chasing me? Usually I'm the ones chasing something. I was doing security on a strip mine. Night shift, 5 p.m. to 5 a.m. Everything was fine for 9 months. One night early November of this year, I was sitting completely alone on a road that overlooks a mountain ridge. You could look out from this road. It was like an overlook and see miles and miles of mountains. There were maybe 30 minutes of daylight left and the sun started to set when I saw small orange and white orbs starting to glow from a nearby mountain inside the tree line. Slowly, as the night fell, I saw the orbs that were glowing in the mountain start to rise from the tree line up into the air. I looked all around me in awe to see dozens of orange, white, and green orbs hovering above me in the sky. Some of them danced, and some of them floated stationary. It was the strangest thing I've ever seen. It began occurring regularly every night that I would work. On one occasion, I saw a bright, glowing orange orb that looked like a fireball come out of a nearby mountain and fly across the sky very slowly right before it would disappear again behind another mountain. The last night that I worked up there, I was sitting there watching the ridge light up with orbs, and then I saw this huge orange one look almost as if it was coming from within the mountain and shot up into the sky as it got closer to me. I witnessed it travel a mile in less than 30 seconds, and it looked like a giant ball of fire. It got about 300 feet away from me, and it was like nothing I've ever seen or witnessed before. It looked like a giant orange fireball of gas with pulsating lights coming out from it. I felt super weak and sick to my stomach, but I was terrified. I raced off the site as fast as I could, in the company vehicle, almost feeling like I was going to vomit from terror. I'd really appreciate it if anyone had any kind of explanation for what I saw. I was 15 at the time. I took about 10 of my little cousins with me to the park. 3 of my older cousins, but still younger than me or the same age, came to help me. As I approached the park, there was a man and 2 other kids there. He came up to me and started talking to me. I tried to give him the hint that I didn't want to talk, but he kept on going. "Oh, did you bring your kids with you?" He nods and kept talking. Then asked me weird questions like, "Are you married? Are those your kids? How old are you?" I lied about my name and age and tried to walk away. Then he said, "I like you. Want to sit and talk?" I said I had something important to tell my family first and that I'd join him after. I smiled and went up to one of my older cousins and said, "Pretend everything's okay, but we need to go now." She nodded and I watched as the 2 kids left without the man. So he started walking home again, and I made sure he didn't follow or watch where we went. I later found out he had picked up one of my little cousins and put him down again, and one of my cousins saw, but she froze and didn't say anything to me. Luckily, one of us saw him walk into a house, so we called the police. They went into the house and found him. They couldn't charge him with anything, but told us that they've received several complaints from him before. Something I left out was that I've seen him at the park previously. I would go there with my boyfriend to hang out, and one time he was there just staring at me. He didn't approach us or say anything to me. I'm assuming it's because my boyfriend was with me, but I really hope to certainly not meet him again. Several months ago, my wife and I went to bed as we normally do. I have untreated sleep apnea, which means that I never really get a good night's sleep and I'm always tired. I can lie down and be asleep in the middle of a sentence. As I was in that extremely short period of not awake but not really asleep, I could feel myself sinking deeper into sleep. As I approached true sleep, I had a brief impression of being in another location, with a nurse nearby saying, "Doctor, he's starting to wake up." I knew somehow that I had been in a coma and that I was starting to get out of it. Then I started flipping back into the coma there while waking up here and hearing the nurse say, "Never mind, false alarm, he's still in a coma." It was just like an old-fashioned balance scale, as on one side it rose and the other fell. It happened again a second time, but I'm not sure if it was that night or the next. I had a bad dissociative episode recently and the memory of this fed into it. After all, if everything here is a coma dream, I may have loved ones there waiting for me to wake up.